You need something, like some sort of shared value or common ground. It doesn't have to be a lot, if you're willing to start basic. I think a lot of the times discussions get stuck because there's enough common ground to have a discussion, but one of the people doesn't want to go back to basics. They don't want to deal with that much of an inferential distance gap and learn to understand someone who isn't from like a close cousin in their subculture. Like they're used to dealing with people who are similar enough to them that they can make a lot of assumptions and never really learn how to communicate or think properly because they just assume what other people mean and other people assume what they mean and no one's communicating properly. But because everyone's like similar enough, this is all obscured and they don't notice that there's like a lot less communication happening than they think there is. So anyways, if you deal with people like that, which is very, very common, then it's a large culture shock for them to have to speak plainly and figure out how to actually communicate things instead of having people guess what you meant. Like, there's always some guesswork, but you can like explain a lot or just explain a few hints and people, and if you're stereotypical enough and the other person knows the stereotypes, then you barely have to communicate for them to know what you mean. And also you can have low standards, so even if they get it wrong, you just sort of go with it anyways. That's pretty common too. Anyways, when people are used to that, it's a huge culture shock to try to actually say what they mean and be literal and think through what are all their assumptions, because you can't communicate with someone who has a different background context unless you figure out what are a bunch of my assumptions that this person doesn't share, and then I'll have to actually say those. So most people don't want to do that kind of project. So like the typical problem is not that they're incapable. Like I think there's enough, they know English, they know arithmetic, they have some ideas about rationality and truth, like some very basic concept of it, some introductory stuff. And like I think that's enough that you could build on it if people wanted to. The problem is they don't want to. And they think it would lower their social status to look like a beginner and go through that kind of thing. Yeah, I like the inferential distance articles from Less Wrong, by the way, which are related to this problem. But I've had very little success bringing that kind of thing up. In fact, in my first post on Less Wrong when I came back recently, I said that I think we'll have a big inferential distance gap here. And the first comment response I got said, you know, they started arguing with me a bit, and then they said, also, this isn't an inferential distance gap, meaning sort of like you're just wrong, or, you know, which is kind of a silly thing to say. Like, they don't know much about me and my perspective, and then when I tell them there's a inferential distance gap and they think there isn't, it's a little bit like I say I disagree with them and they say, no, we don't disagree. It's like, if someone's saying they disagree with you, they probably usually are right. There are exceptions, but it's a hard thing to argue with someone who's saying, we agree, there's no problem here. If one person thinks there's a problem, generally there's a problem. Because, like, either there's a problem or they're misunderstanding something, which is a problem. Anyway, so I said there's an inferential distance gap, and the guy's response was more or less, you know, from my context, from my perspective, on my premises, there's something else going on here. It looks this other way to me. And I'm like, yeah, of course it does, because we have an inferential distance gap. So the thing it looks like to you is not what it looks like to me. That's what I was telling you would happen. So of course it looks like something bad to you. You're looking at it in a totally different way than I intended it. The other thing is, I've gotten like initial agreement to try to deal with an inferential distance gap with people. But what happens next doesn't work because so what you have to do is basically exponentially back off to find common ground. It's like binary search. And the thing they want to do is like linearly back off like a couple steps at a time. And so like the discussion starts at 1,000,000, common ground is at 100, and they want to back off like 20 at a time. And I want to back off by like more than half because we have a long ways to go. And the thing is, once I start communicating that to them, how big the issue is, and how basic we have to go, because they are, and the reason for that is that they're not competent at a lot of things they think they're competent at. Like, they just use words wrong and get basic math wrong and stuff like that. That's almost everyone. So to find common ground, you have to go to, like, stuff that they're actually reliably competent at. And they think that they're, like, better at a lot of stuff than they are. Then they want to use that as common ground, but you don't actually have common ground there because I'm doing it differently than them. That's my interpretation of what happened. So it's very threatening to them to find out how bad at stuff they are, but you can't properly go all the way back to common ground without some sort of admission about how bad at stuff they are, because common ground it has to be stuff you're both good at. So it has to exclude everything that they're bad at. Okay, so Gigahertz agreed with that thing. Where is it? Here it is. I agree. Other people can intensify. Yes, it can be even worse with third parties present. My major claim is fair. Slightly out of sync on our perception of social dynamics and how much they subtract. Okay. Okay, so where's that objectivity part? Okay, it's over here. It's this branch. Yeah, so my short answer is that there's two separate issues. So there's issue number one that is a skill issue. Like, I agree that's totally a thing. Like, the thing he's talking about is a real problem, and there's a skill you can learn, and it helps. But I think there's, like, a separate issue, a second issue, that the skill doesn't deal with. And that's what I was trying to actually talk about. Yeah, Popperian philosophy has stuff about this as well. For example, a well-known Popper phrase is, let ideas die in your place. I think it's stead in the quote, let ideas die in your stead. Yeah, so this is a like, you can start here, but at some point you reach conclusions. They're still tentative and you can detach from them, but they're also meaningful. Like, you can spend, you can reach a conclusion and then 20 years later you still have that conclusion and you've done a lot of work that builds on it. So if it's wrong, you've built on an error a lot. So that's meaningful. Like, it's not fundamentally irrational. Mistakes happen. But it looks bad from a social status perspective. Social status is not forgiving of building your career on a mistake and all your work being worthless. I think that identity is important, and it's not an inherently bad thing. There's certainly bad ways to do it where you're overly attached to your ideas or something. But you can't just be, like, infinitely neutral and never take sides either, or you won't do anything. Like, you have to make some bets on some ideas over others. You have to choose some values to pursue in your life, some projects, some interests, etc. And then when you make those choices, yes, they're changeable. And, like, don't get hung up on them because of the sunk cost problem. But they do partly define who you are. And it's important when you're wrong about a major bet that you invest a lot in, and it makes sense that that's a social status threat. Like, you can find a way to look at it rationally and be okay with it if it was, a reasonable bet given the available information and so on. But I think social status just doesn't evaluate things in an adequately rational way. So even if you're okay with it, you can still find that your social status is threatened because an idea that is associated with you for reasonable reasons turns out to be wrong. There are other issues, like if you have a debate with someone, who wins the debate provides evidence about who knew more, who would, like, research the topic better, etc. Or who had better, like, background knowledge and other sources to draw on to help them see the topic and analyze the topic in a better way. And yeah, we don't have to be overly attached to our ideas, and we can learn from each other. But the social world cares, like, who was better, who taught who more, etc. And if it's a one-time exception, it's okay. But if there's, like, patterns where you're consistently being the person who's, like, wrong and learning from the other guy, the social hierarchy is not going to be nice about that. I think just social rules are not rational. They're not designed and defined to make rationality and learning and progress work well. And I also think objectively there's not that much difference between I was wrong, my idea was wrong, this idea that I've held for a while was wrong, this idea that I've put a lot of research into was wrong, this idea that I made several life decisions based on turned out to be wrong. Those are all pretty similar. I don't think those things are ruinous to truth seeking. Like, you can deal with them, and yes, it does take skill to deal with them well. But I think they have like some meaning. It's like part of the situation. It's not just like I don't think just trying to stay neutral can solve that problem and make all those things go away. Rushing to conclusions is common for a lot of reasons. One of them is that people don't like to have open problems. They often want to just have some sort of answer and close up the topic, and instead of living with an ongoing sort of tension where they have to deal with uncertainty and unknowns on an ongoing basis. I don't think I personally have problems with this stuff, but I think the social dynamics of it make it very hard for people who are more invested in the social hierarchy than I am. And also there are rationality skills involved that plenty of people have trouble with. But I think even people who study rationality and are okay at that part, they're usually too invested in the social hierarchy, so they still have significant trouble with this stuff. Yeah, I think having independent self-esteem is important. Ayn Rand writes about that as well. Yeah, so to deal with this problem, you need two things. You need a rationality skill to look at things objectively, like, we have a table and we put the ideas on index cards and then we just toss them all on the table and then we throw criticisms at them, and like, no, you don't have to like take sides. You can argue for all the different sides. That kind of thing. And then some people get decent at that. Most don't really, but some do. That's not like such a huge problem. It's just like a medium problem. But then even when people get decent at that, I think concern for status makes it a huge problem in a lot of cases anyways. So you can see this, like, some people are decent at that stuff when talking to a couple friends in private who they trust, because then there's a lot less of a status threat. And then the same people in public will act quite differently. So if you see like public-private behavior differences, then that shows the issue is more about the status issues than the rationality skill. I think emotions are overrated, and you can value things and care about things, and live in reality and deal with the world instead of being detached from the whole world without being highly emotional about it. But I don't think emotions are people's main problems. Like, I think emotions are generally a downstream consequence of an error rather than the cause of the error. Like, there's something that triggers the emotion in the first place. Like, I think emotions are basically very fast responses to people's interpretations of a situation or an event or something like that. So when they have negative emotions about something, it's because they think something bad's going on. They see it negatively in some way. Their analysis, they did some sort of analysis, they reached some sort of negative conclusion, then they got emotional. And that often prevents further analysis. So it's like their initial analysis sees a problem, then they get emotional, then the emotions get in the way of doing more analysis and figuring it out better. So if they get the initial analysis wrong, then the emotions get in the way of correcting it. But I think like initially the first thing that happens is not a negative emotion. It's some sort of interpretation of the situation. Some reason you think it's rationally, objectively bad for you, or will hurt you in terms of social standing. Like, other people will think it's bad for you even though it's not, is also a threat. Anyway, so you have some sort of understanding of what's going on, which is negative, and it's very quick. And then you feel bad, and then it gets in the way of further analysis. But I think basically emotions follow our opinions instead of dictating them. Because a lot of people view emotions as like causeless, or like self-causing or something. Like, the emotion is just sort of this thing that has power over you. Whereas I think people create their own emotions according to some sort of ideas they have. Can cause positive feedbacks and amplify problems, though, Because like something can look a little bad to you, and then you feel a little bad, and then the fact that you're feeling bad seems bad to you, so you like it makes the situation seem worse to you because you're feeling bad, which you take as like additional evidence. Then the situation seems worse, so then you feel worse, and now you're feeling worse, which you take as evidence. So then the situation seems even worse, and then you feel even worse. I think feedback loops like that are a thing that happens and causes trouble. And that's one of the reasons the emotional response sometimes doesn't seem to correspond very well to the situation. Another reason that emotional responses don't seem to correspond well to the situation is past history. Like if people have had ongoing problems with someone, they'll often like majorly escalate or just jump ahead at initial problems because they've had so many problem solving failures in the past. So it seems sort of hopeless to them, and they just jump to sort of where they're at with that person in general about how bad things are. But I think that that is an evaluation. It's something like, I have a problem with this person, like my parent, and I'm like, 6 or something. Like, this is common with kids and parents. Like, yeah, kid-parent conflict. Kid knows that he's tried lots of things without getting his problem solved very well or getting much help. So he thinks anything he does below a certain level of escalation isn't going to get him anywhere due to past experience. So he immediately does a massive escalation to what he thinks is the minimum that ever helps at all. And so I think that that sort of massive emotional reaction and escalation can be related to an actual judgment about the situation. Okay. What did I say here? Oh, people focus on social dynamics. They care more about social status than truth. They don't want to change their goals because social status is their goal. Okay. Social dynamics is part of the world, just like a volcano, a tsunami, sub-zero temperatures. It's a hazard you have to deal with. And the thing about social dynamics is that the straightforward strategies for dealing with it, as in trying to get good at it and win the game, cause people to become dishonest and irrational, and it like corrupts them from within and destroys them. That's my basic opinion. So you need to find other strategies, like what can you do from the outside instead of playing the game. I think playing the game is just really dangerous. You can play it like a little and maybe survive, but I think if you play the game a lot, then like no one survives. Right, so I think you can do a little of that, but I think, and it will help some, but if you want to optimize it more and you keep trying to get it more and more optimized, then I think it will destroy you. So I think that you can compromise with it a bit and survive, but if you want really good outcomes, you need like severe workarounds, like majorly circumventing the system in some way, rather than working within the system. Which is why I look for things like, how can you design written rules that override social dynamics? Like, it's like how the scientific method gives people a lot of structure to their activities. So if you follow the method and the things scientists are supposed to do, it leaves you a lot less wiggle room to act badly according to bias or social climbing or whatever. And you can do that with discussion as well, so that people have a lot less like freedom to play favorites or be biased or take social actions. Like if there are a bunch of written rules that limit actions, then those can keep people honest and non-social. And then wherever there's like a gap, people are going to be really social or something else bad. I think it has to be acknowledged as a major problem, and you have to have explicit norms for dealing with it. Like, I think if you just say, like, try your best and we'll write some articles about it, it's going to be prevalent at your forum. You need, like, a lot more than that before much changes. Like, even at my own forum, which has taken a lot more measures than Less Wrong has, I think it's still reasonably prevalent. Okay, before I know exactly what it is, my general comments are optimize for dealing with the best people. Really high value things, or like greatness is like uncommon or rare. And even some people are mixed with like a high variance. So people with high variance can have some like really valuable ideas. Whereas someone who's like, 80th percentile with zero variance, they never have the best idea on anything, so there's not much value there. Anyways, yeah, optimize for the best people is my general opinion. You don't want to act in a way where the best people won't like you or something will go wrong with them. Type 1, rejection of true null hypothesis. Type 2 is non-rejection of a false null hypothesis, also known as false negative. Oh, false positive, false negative. Okay, so I think false negatives on really great people are the worst. So avoid those first. False positives, um, false positives aren't so dangerous in conversation because you're always getting more feedback. If you have a false positive where you're like, okay, this person's great, I know the answer, and then you stop evaluating them, that's really dangerous. But if you have a false positive where you think, okay, this person looks good, and then you keep talking to them and you find out they're bad, like 5 messages later, that's not a big deal. Like, you invest extra energy in 5 messages because they looked promising. And like, writing high quality messages, even to dumb people, is not really a bad thing to do sometimes. You still get some value out of that. So yeah, as long as you don't shut your mind and stop evaluating people, I think false positives are often very temporary. Whereas false negatives are permanent. Basically. Yeah. See, that's one of the things that like my paths forward stuff tries to deal with, is there should be mechanisms where if you false negative someone, they can correct it, like it can actually get fixed. But most people don't really have mechanisms for that. Like, they'll false negative you, and then there's just no way to fix it, and that sucks. So like, I have explicit policies to deal with that. Like my debate policy. This is a false negative policy. If I false negative someone, they can invoke my debate policy. I'm making public, transparent promises about what I'll do in certain conditions, and they keep me honest because, like, it's a public commitment. It's not very hard to. It's all stuff that's like pretty easy to objectively evaluate. And I think I have the kind of audience that would hold me accountable or would notice if I went against my policies. Anyway, so yeah, like, this is an anti-false negative policy. Sometimes people look dumb to me and I stop talking to them, but if they like want to override that, I have an option for them. A lot of people are just sort of very hostile to outliers because the majority of outliers are negative. But yeah, I think having stuff that deals with positive outliers well is really important. Let me find a David Deutsch quote. Okay, so Sarah posted all these quotes of insults people say, including in particular a bunch that contradict each other or contradict reality. Like, for example, they were called socialists when they are in fact in favor of capitalism. Very much not socialists. Right, so it has been called a collectivist, right-wing, PC, fascist, randroid, anarchist. And no, they didn't mean anarcho-capitalist. Also subjectivist, relativist, moralistic, amoral, irrational, a cold rationalist, etc. Anyway, this is context. People say a lot of mean things. So David Deutsch responded, what provokes this hatred and vilification and blind misunderstanding? I think it's this. Someone who is far in advance of most people about an important moral issue is likely not to be understood at first, and in the meantime, to be hated and vilified just as much as someone who is egregiously wrong. How could it be otherwise? The way it could be otherwise is if people were nicer to outliers and more tolerant. This is from 2001. Yeah, this is in fact like days after I joined the discussion forum. I joined in like November or December 2001. Yeah, so I think another way to put it is you want to have outlier friendly policies. Rejecting If you reject all outliers, you get rid of the negative outliers and the positive outliers. And the negative outliers are way more numerous. There's way more ways to be wrong than right. But I still think it's not even close to worth it. There's also value in variance, variety, diversity, etc. Like the more you only look at a narrow swath of the bell curve, the more you're losing diversity. So there's a downside there as well. But the larger problem is that so much value and progress can come from positive outliers. Also, sometimes the same person is a positive and negative outlier. Because like there's two ways to be positive to become a positive outlier. One, you can increase your mean. The other is you can increase your standard deviation. You can increase your variance. There's some people who have some really valuable ideas and also a bunch of terrible ideas. And that's still really valuable because only the best few ideas on each topic actually count. So like being consistently not the best, like isn't very useful because we can just take the best ideas and not worry about like the 8th best. So if someone manages to have more variance to contribute any ideas at all that actually are the best in their field or make some sort of significant contribution, that's really valuable. Whereas someone else can have a much higher mean but much lower variance and never contribute anything that really matters. But if you can find someone who's not just high variance but high mean, or possibly like a bit of both, that's I think better.